Alright, so of course to end the film adaptations that came from different seasons, now we can talk about Stand By Me. And if you were around watching the videos on this channel roughly 5 years ago, you might know that this is not my first time talking about Stand By Me, which of course comes from The Body out of different seasons. And it's clearly a very faithful adaptation. There's some very significant changes that were made going into it, but overall it's one of those cases where whenever I'm reading it out of the book, I can so vividly see the movie in my head, and the other way around, where whenever I'm watching the movie, there are things that I remember that are described in specific detail in the book. And they just really go hand in hand, even despite the changes that were ultimately made, which we'll go into, and whether or not which ones work better as far as what King wrote down and what the movie ended up being. So, obviously, the first thing to really go into is just sort of the general nature of the four characters and how they have that bond, where a lot of people, rightfully, will probably argue that there is one particular aspect in stories that King does even better than he does horror. And that's sort of the relationships and bonds with children, like young children, particularly growing up in like sort of in the 50s area. And this is pretty much that, like, as he takes that aspect that he does really well and basically makes it the story, rather than kind of the sort of center with things going on, whether it be like It or Dreamcatcher or whatever. Hearts in Atlantis has a very coming-of-age feel to it as well, which we'll talk about right after this, actually. So, going into this, you look at the four... That's kind of the thing of the like group as a whole, where even if it's one of those cases where the era doesn't really necessarily matter, the dynamic between them and the characters and where they're coming from feel so relatable and so universal that probably anybody that had, you know, a small group of friends growing up will find some way to relate to this movie. And the individual characters, you can probably pinpoint people in your actual life. Like, you know, this guy was very much the Chris of my life. This guy was very much the Teddy in my life at the time. And hopefully either you were more of the Gordy or the Vern. I feel like I was kind of, like... I was not even just the writer aspect, but I was Gordy with like a little bit of Vern, but I definitely knew Chris's and Teddy's, and yeah, more Verns. Verns are everywhere. So, and the great thing about that is the way that they were able to make Gordy the center, because even though it is the body is, you know, pretty much told from his perspective, Rob Reiner still felt that it was like kind of an ensemble in the book, and he wanted much more of a focus on one particular character, and he knew that character was going to be Gordy. And I do like that, usually in that case, when you need somebody that's just kind of a surrogate, that we're just kind of getting the story through, that character tends to kind of be the most bland, and just kind of this empty face that anybody can put their own onto. But Gordy still absolutely has like a real arc here that the movie actually did expand on even further when Reiner made that decision to make it even more of a Gordy focus than it already was. Because he's got all this, you know, stuff going on in his life. He just lost his brother Denny, which caused like his whole family to basically just shut down. Now he feels unwanted. Because he was the one that... It's always that case of there was the one that was really on their way to success, and the one that knew what they were going to do. The one that was basically like a local celebrity because he just did everything right. And then you have the little brother that has no idea what he wants to do. And of course it's the older brother that dies, and now all these eyes are... It's almost like everybody's eyes but his own parents are on him, because it's like whenever they see him, it's like, you know, like when he goes to get food and has that run-in with the clerk, and it's like, you're the little brother that's not real... That he basically implies, so you're the other one. Like, there was the one where they knew every aspect about Denny and everything about his life and what he was going to be and what he was. And Gordy's just the other one. And that's this. You can see through the whole story and movie the toll that that's taking on him, because he doesn't really. He isn't as, like, extroverted as, say, like a Teddy, for instance, where all his problems are very much on the. And it's funny how they're, when you look at Teddy, all the stuff that's been, like, particularly traumatizing to him, and really Chris for that matter, yet it's, like, all on the table, and Gordy's is more, like, internalized and sort of eating away inside of him, which in a way probably makes him more prone to break at any second, because people like, Chris and Teddy are just constantly dealing with it. It's like how, like, kind of like when you were growing up, and unfortunately, surely we all knew people like Teddy at some point, and it's that case of these kids that grow up in, like, abusive households, but the way they talk about it, which I would assume is their way of coping with it, is whenever they talk about what goes on in their home life, they're almost like, it almost feels like they're bragging about it in a way. To where it's like, or if you have somebody that also kind of comes from that sort of background, it becomes like a game of one up, like who has the worst life. And you kind of get the sense that that would be, we would see much more of that in Teddy if he had more to relate to in this group. Because for the most part, even though you can group together Gordy and Vern as the not so bad kids versus versus Chris and Teddy, who are come from those backgrounds and may or may not be destined to go down the wrong paths, and become more like Ace, the sort of antagonist that's kind of looming over the whole thing. It's basically like this sort of, Ace almost works as like this crystal ball throughout the movie of, if all these kids go down a certain path, like all it takes is really one turn, and then you could be Ace at the end of your run. Or worse. We do already know before the movie even really starts that Chris has died by stabbing during an altercation in a restaurant after he got as far as to be an attorney, and then obviously tragedy struck. And this seems to be what kind of sets it off in this older Gordy that's played by Richard Dreyfuss to basically start writing the events that we see, and he's basically writing the body, basically. So when you look at that, as far as like individually, you could look. What I really like is that I don't really remember Chris standing out much in the novella, really at all. Like, he was just kind of another kid that was there. But obviously casting River Phoenix added a whole other layer to this because of what he was able to bring. And at the young age that he was when they made this. But that sort of, he's the kid that you don't want to be. Like, I know in my head clearly a Chris that I knew and felt close to very early in life, in like elementary school, like in the 3rd to 4th grade area. But with Chris, they added a different layer where he's the bad kid going down the bad road, but he's also loyal, especially to friends like Gordy. And he sees in Gordy, like, the fact that he knows he's never going to go in the directions that Gordy probably will, and he continues to try to push him in those directions. It's basically, he straight up says, don't go down the path that I'm probably going to. He already knows at that young age, I'm going to be stuck here, and that's probably not going to go well, especially with the people I interact with and the people I'm related to and all of that. But at the same time, what's interesting and really ironic in a way is that loyalty from Chris is basically, Chris is able to give Gordy what he's missing from his own family, who's really, it almost seems like they're trying to pretend he doesn't even exist, strictly because he's not Dennis, his older brother. So all this advice he's giving him is basically fatherly advice, but he has to get it from a kid his own age who is going down the wrong path. And there's just such a tragedy in that, but weirdly a realistic tragedy. Like, it really feels like those sort of interactions and those sort of friendships are probably out there all over the place, where it's interesting how a lot of the time people that are going down a bad path at a really early age know that that's what's happening to them, but they just they're so stuck in it that they just sort of have embraced it and just end up going down that path, and then that's where it all starts. But not necessarily all cases, but in many cases, I imagine. I'm really not some. I'm just throwing shit out there. I'm not some expert on anything, but that's the vibe I get. I guess you could say. And then with Teddy, what's really interesting is we've talked a lot about him already, but the thing that really stands out about Teddy in particular, which is another thing that you can absolutely relate to the people in your life that you might be able to immediately relate Teddy to, that you knew in your childhood, where he's such a ball of explosive emotions from all different areas. Like he's either going to be the funny one that likes to joke around and mess around, or he's going to blow up in anger, or he's going to burst into tears. And he's so unpredictable, you never know which of those emotions is going to be the reaction to what's ever currently happening to him. Or it could be a mix of both. It could start at one and then turn into another and just becomes a roller coaster. Um, and it's like it really brings out your empathy because it's like, to imagine being that kid, just watching him have to go through the emotions is exhausting. And it's like, just to imagine being that kid and coming from that place is just a really tragic story in itself. And I think that's really the strength of this also, is just how much, because you have, many coming of age movies where it's just the group of kids, and yeah, they have their own problems or whatever, but it really feels like, in even more of a grand way than usual with movies like this, that all four of these kids have their own movie in them, that we could go through, and each one would be like this huge, emotional, revelatory roller coaster. Because you've also got Vern, but there's a lot of kind of irony in Vern also, because he's the one that's basically afraid of everything. And he's trying to, anytime it looks like there's like a really difficult task at hand, Vern's the first one that tries to think of the easy way out of it. But all of this was his idea. Like he, like he was the one that addressed that there was the body and they should go see it. This all started because of him, and yet he's the one that is afraid, like the most afraid of every new turn in this journey. And I said it would be really easy for him to just be a really annoying character, but Jerry O'Connell really perfected this character in the sense that he's obviously annoying, but in like that relatable way, to where it's not unbearable to watch him, because no matter how annoying he is, there's probably some real life aspect of somebody, if not somebody else, maybe even yourself a little bit, that you can just identify. And so it's almost like the more unbearable Vern is to the group, the more funny it is to you, considering you can probably relate to it. Or like I said, basically know a Vern. Uh, so, and of course, with Gordy, there's also the certain other relatable aspects, like if you're me and do like the whole writing thing, there's something annoyingly relatable in the moment when he's telling the story, the Barfarama story, and obviously we're kind of seeing the start of what we know ends up being like a writing career he goes into, and he ends up becoming successful. Um, and when he gets to the end of the story, and it kind of happens throughout the story in the novella, if I remember correctly, where he's got a story in his mind that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's perfectly put together. And he tells them this story, and everybody wants their input. Everybody wants to change the ending. Like maybe this aspect isn't right or that thing or whatever. And just watching Gordy's reaction to these terrible takes on this story that he's really mapped out is very relatable. We also go into that where we get the whole story as written in the book, but there's also another story by the I think it's not quite like the adult Gordy, but somewhere in like maybe his late teens, I think, where he's like still in school. He wrote something called Stud City, I think it was called, and it's a decent chunk of the novella. And it's one of those cases of you're not quite sure what, maybe it is, but I've never really heard anything specific. Like, what is it that's, what's the significance of Stud City within the context of everything else? Like, is there something subliminal about it? Because obviously, there's a few things in there that make it clear that it's like, some of it's his way, like showing how therapeutic writing could be for his character, and there's some references that make you think of Denny and how he's probably still coping with that tragedy through these stories, just in like a really subtle way. Um, so there's that, but there's other things in here that seem open for interpretation, sort of like his run-in with the deer, where he's just sort of sitting there and he's alone while everybody else is still asleep, and this deer just kind of walks up to him. And he says the same thing in the movie that he does in the novella, which is he didn't tell anybody about the deer. He just kind of kept that as his own thing, and he never said anything about the deer until he's writing it in the moment, as he's narrating. And I guess the way I always kind of took, I can't remember if the novella went in. It's been a while since I read the novella, but I can't remember if this got into specifics. But the way I always took the deer scene was kind of when you talk about the individualism of the characters and the fact that they know at some point, probably very soon, they're all going to be going their separate ways. And for the most part, through their childhood up to this point, they've been the group. Where it's like if one thinks one thing, then the rest, they're basically like a four-headed creature. And so this is like his first real moment of like individualism where he has like something that's just his. And it's almost like kind of the beginning of they're all going to start going their own separate ways. And their lives in total will start becoming like that individual thing that the other people in the group don't really know about. That's pretty much the way I took that. But yeah, but another thing they do in regards to Gordy being the focus that's a really big moment is the final confrontation with Ace at the body, where I do like that the movie kind of dramatized it a little less. Like it makes a good visual when you're reading it and you're kind of imagining everything in your head for yourself. That it all takes place during like a rain storm that kind of turns into hail and makes it like really super dramatic visually. But I like that the emotion is so at the core of this moment in the movie that they didn't go that route. It's just, during the day. But the other change is giving Gordy the gun and pulling it on Ace. If I remember correctly, it's Chris that does it in the novella, but it's like this whole turning point that Gordy has where we talk about where he's coming from and all the problems in his life. Whether it be what happened to Denny or how his parents reacted to it and how he feels shut out from his family and in a sense shut out of his own life because of all this. And he just kind of feels like he has no place in life. And he has that dream in both the book and the movie where he's at the funeral and his dad asks him, or his dad tells him it should have been you. And it's all kind of building up to this. Like, it doesn't feel just like a moment of he's standing up to Ace. It's like he's basically, this is the breaking point of everything. And when he looks at Ace and pulls the gun on him, he basically sees every problem he's ever had in his life in that moment. And I thought that was pretty much perfect to give Gordy that moment. Where, like I said, they both work in their own context, but with putting, I exactly see, especially in this moment, what Reiner meant when he said he wanted one particular of the characters to be like a real focus and have like more of a sort of in the foreground arc when it came to this. So it feels like we actually reached this moment, and obviously they sort of keep us on that high in the movie and kind of go out on it in a way I really like, because that works for the movie, and I love that. Like, I would not change that as far as the way the movie did it. But I do also like the sort of reality that the book puts us in, because the book does go into a whole sort of epilogue where Ace does retaliate, and he hospitalizes or nearly hospitalizes them, and tracks all of them down one at a time and just beats the holy shit out of them. and they just deal with it. And then another part that's sort of like an epilogue that the movie doesn't touch on is when he is an adult and he goes back into town and he actually sees Ace again. Kind of feels like the perfect punctuation to that whole thing of Ace is what they're destined for if they don't go down a better path, and like that he basically sees Ace, and it's super undramatic. He sees him from a distance, and he just looks like any other loser walking around. It's just this really interesting, more or less cathartic thing. But there's also the whole thing of the outcome, like as far as learning where they do end up going. And this is another case of the book and the movie do it in two totally different ways, and I think they both work. Like I said, there's almost like this crashing reality. The crashing reality is certainly apparent in the movie, but like much harsher in the book, where not only everything else we already mentioned, like Ace's retaliation and stuff like that, but with the exception of Gordy, they all died. Not just Chris in the book, with Teddy getting into a car accident and Vern in like a house fire, and it was all when they were like really young also. Because there's the moment in the movie where Chris, interestingly enough, says in passing that Teddy will barely make it past 20. When we know that in the movie Chris is the only one that actually ends up dying. But what I think is interesting about this is that there's when you look at the idea of, with the exception of Gordy, they all die. Rather than that just being like almost sort of a misery porn sort of thing, what I do think makes it really work is that the whole concept of it, the whole concept of the book is, and I think there's something to be said here about the way the titles differentiate, where the novella is called The Body, whereas this is Stand By Me, and it's, you get more of that. But as far as, thinking about the title being The Body, and the whole concept being going to see the Brower kid's body, there is like this constant sort of, like death is constantly looming feel that you get from just the whole story itself. And so it's like the fact that this all centers around them, thinking about mortality and fate and all that stuff, because they're all, like, to themselves, because they're all going to see a dead body that's a kid that's more or less their age, and they have to confront this. It almost seems inevitable that they meet those fates. So not that long after this event happens, like death was just looming the whole time. I guess you could say starting with Denny and then just going forward. But I really like the way it's done in the movie also, because like I said, the movie doesn't feel like it has something as dark looming over it as the descriptions in the book go, and with those ultimate fates. But the idea to learn that, well, like I said, we know right away that Chris has died, but when we get the fates of Teddy and Vern, where they're just kind of, like, Vern just ended up kind of leading a really boring life, and Teddy, ended up getting into a lot of trouble, but more or less just has a mundane life going from, like, job to job or whatever, and Vern has the family and all that. The reason I think this really works also in a different way is the fact that they all still went their separate, like, when they all die, they obviously have no choice but to have gone their separate ways because they're all dead now. But as far as them going their separate ways and like hardly ever seeing each other again, yet still being alive, gives that idea of like obviously Gordy, being the writer, seems to have the most clear memory. But it leaves that question of just like people that you knew when you were younger, and you have these memories of your childhood in your head, and you wonder, do those people still have those memories or not? Or maybe they do, but they remember them differently. And the idea that, at least the other two, Teddy and Vern, are still out there. And so the memories from these particular 2 days are still kind of, out there in various places. And there's something to that also, I think, that works in just as an effective way, even if, like, totally different also. And talking about it being 2 days also, there is a moment where they say at the end, where Gordy says at the end, it's interesting how it only felt, like it was only 2 days, but when they came back it felt like the town was different, and it felt like so much, it just felt like this whole, like, epic journey had happened when 2 days is really nothing. And it's like, what's interesting about that is I feel like you can actually equate that to the movie's runtime. This movie is only an hour and 28 minutes. It doesn't even break an hour and a half. Yet it feels like so much happens. Like there's so many like individual events which will turn into individual memories, and there's so many emotions we go through. They have fun. They almost die getting run over by a train. They have the confrontation with Ace. There's the leeches. There's everything. Gordy telling the story. It feels like there's so many individual events. It makes it feel so incredibly epic, but it's in just this really short amount of time. Um, and but yet at the same time, it's almost like how when you're younger, like periods of time feel much longer. Like a year when you're a kid is literally an eternity. And then as you get older, even now in like your late 20s, a year is nothing at all. Like a year is basically snapping once, and then there it is. Like I said, it was already 5 years ago. I last did a video on Stand By Me, which really doesn't feel all that long ago. Um, so yeah, and that's the whole thing too is how much can change in that time. Like I remember vaguely what I talked about, and I talked about the different being able to relate to the friends also. But when you're talking about like the novella, and you get to that point eventually where the people you knew and grew up with are starting to die off, and it's like I'm not even 30 yet, and I think maybe 5 or 6 people I went to school with are already gone, which is terrifying. But and in different ways. And that's the thing too, where it's just like this constant confronting of mortality, to where you can see this movie in this story as very bittersweet, but it can also be like when it first hits you, it can be like really really depressing also. Um, but the power of that only makes it more memorable and why it sticks with people so much because it can make you relate to this feeling so much and so vividly. Even stuff like just the way they interact when they're not even really doing when they're just being like in mundane cases where they're just like hanging out in the junkyard or whatever, where it's like how they almost like speak in their own sort of catchphrases. Like I don't know how else to word that, but when you have memories of your childhood and your group of friends, just the way you talk to each other, it was like you almost sort of made like in your own friend group like catchphrases where you could just say people would just say like the same things over and over again all the time, and it would just never get old. I remember specifically like joke telling was like we would all like tell the same jokes like over and over again, word for word, just to see who told it better, even though we wouldn't change the phrasing. You get very much like it'll just this movie and this story will just snatch memories like that and bring them back into the foreground of your brain just like out of nowhere. Where it'll just be like just like one scene or one line or the way they laugh at something or say something like the whole what is Goofy debate has probably come up in any conversation at some point. um, yeah, and then the two for flinching thing. I particularly love the moment when, because this is, as I said, this is just that relatable thing where it's, and that's the thing too, is this, like the two for flinching thing, you can tell these are things from like, the 50s, yet they're still universal enough that you can identify, yeah, that's basically the kind of things we did in like the 90s also. And there's that moment I love where this kind of goes into the Vern thing also, where it's a very identifiable moment where it's Vern's always the victim of two for flinching, especially with Teddy. But there's the moment where Vern makes him flinch, and he says two for flinching without hitting him again, so Teddy just hits him, even though Teddy's the one that flinched, and you can just see Vern's brain like fry. Like, this isn't the way this is supposed to go. Why am I always the punching bag no matter any scenario? Like, even when I win, I lose. And just little character moments like that just really stick out in this really real way that are great. And another thing that these stories touch on that's really relatable, especially when you're thinking about like childhood and the way our imaginations can go into overdrive, is that and this is when you bring in the idea of this is a non-horror story from King, yet he's still able to kind of sneak those horror elements in because there are so many things in your life in childhood that aren't horror, but your imagination will turn into horror. Like when he's like in the book, this doesn't come up in the movie, but in the book when he's talking about going into Denny's room, but it's like this really scary thing because Denny's dead, and in childhood that's like just an automatically sort of monstrous horror like thing. Like when he's like in the room and he's imagining like Denny's gonna come out of the closet, but he's gonna have like bloody claws and stuff like that. And it's like that's just the weird shit that your mind would come up with as a kid. Like anything could suddenly be this really scary or horrifying situation. And there are times when you like have those moments in childhood where you actually come to realize that, like the whole thing about the dog Chopper in the junkyard, where Chopper's like this myth, and you imagine like this really big gigantic. It comes obviously this came later, but you immediately think of the dog in The Sandlot, where there's the legend versus what he actually is. In this case, Chopper is extremely unthreatening. But just the imagination from childhood has taken off so much that it can build literally anything. And it's shocking to them to see that Chopper is not in any way threatening whatsoever after all that. And the way it deals with that stuff. Or the stuff like when you... and I had plenty of moments of this as a kid. I remember especially since there was the backyard of my house and then just literally the woods on the other side of the fence. Where they have no real reason to think this whatsoever. No realistic reason. Yet, like I said, it's so convincing when you're a child. When they're in the woods and they're camping out and they're getting ready to go to sleep, and then you can hear the howling going on in the woods, and they just all immediately assume it's the ghost of the Brower kid. And just right then, it's like you just instantly you believe that. Like you could be walking around during the day, just doing whatever, or just playing with your friends or whatever, and nothing supernatural exists, monsters don't exist, nothing is scary. And then the second you're in the woods in the dark, everything exists. Everything's real, and stuff like that really captures that really well. So yeah. Trying to think if there is anything else that needs to be touched on apart from just the way this story and movie bring childhood to life so realistically and so vividly. Like I said, regardless of what's going on in them or the era that it's set in, there's always going to be that sort of relatability that King can always find in this sort of subject matter. And of course, not to mention the movie's just very funny with their interactions and the insults they throw at each other and some of the phrasing and some of the ways that Dreyfuss phrases this in the narration as he's recalling it. Also, a lot of this works comedically also, while also having some really heartbreaking performances in there, particularly the moment where Chris breaks down over stealing money, which in turn was stolen again, and only he was blamed for because of who he is and where he came from, which another case of you can basically chalk up to how another way he felt like he was going to be stuck and just kind of embraced it without thinking he could go down the same path as Gordy, despite the fact that he did try in the long run, but ultimately still meeting an unfortunate fate is really... So just the tragedy really lurking in this. Sometimes it lurks, sometimes it's right there in the open. But it's all there in so many different ways. And like I said, emotions and feelings just go up and down throughout this whole story in this way. Much like, your very fragile emotions when you're a child. It's like in so many different ways and layers, it's the perfect depiction of all these things. But I guess the last thing to really mention, just kind of in passing, because I don't really think much came from it. The fact that whatever you want to call it, the plagiarism controversy that kind of briefly surrounded this story, where a friend of King's claimed that he basically stole the idea of the story from him, and it's actually in this copy of the book, the body is dedicated to that guy. I don't know if that's a tongue-in-cheek thing afterwards, and this is like a different edition than the first. I really don't know, or if that was after the fact, but it is also worth noting, though, that I was pretty sure that a very famous story about King is that when he was a kid, he actually did witness a very young friend, die by getting run over by a train. That he says he has no memory of it, but apparently his mom told him about it after the fact, and he just kind of went into shock when it happened, I think is what the story is. So it's very clear that he had some sort of jumping off point from real life to get to this point. But so I don't really know much else about that. What I know is very vague. So like I said, it didn't really seem to go anywhere, and it doesn't seem to be that popular of a story when the body comes up. So it could just be nothing. I don't know, but I think that's going to be it for this. And as I said before, the next one we're going to go into next week is Hearts in Atlantis. And then after Hearts in Atlantis, we'll be in October, and we'll go into more horror themes with the stories from Four Past Midnight and Full Dark No Stars. So, and then of course October is just going to be horror pretty much nonstop. Whether it be new movies coming out, or verses, or stuff I'm doing with my brother, anything and everything is that. So, and we'll continue with the reviews and stuff like that this month also. We've got another versus playing with my brother. I'll talk about The Devil All the Time and some other new stuff. And yeah, so that's going to be at least the next couple of months. And then when we get to November, I guess we'll just wing it. So until all that stuff, I think that's it.